Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depends on where you are following us from. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I am Abbas Kadhim, Director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council. It is our honor at the Iraq Initiative to be joined by our colleagues from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative to present a timely event on Iraq. And the title of this presentation today will be Assessing Perceptions of Affected Communities in Northern Iraq on Peace, Justice, and Governance. Iraq often in the news almost daily. There is a lot of coverage on Iraqi political affairs, on US-Iraqi relations, on regional issues, security, etc. But there are many stories in Iraq that receive less coverage, and we are grateful for our colleagues at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative to shed light on this important aspect, and also on that affects a wide segment of Iraqis who are and have been displaced for a long time or affected since the conflict began with ISIS in June 2014. This event is on the record. You are welcome to tweet, share the information on it. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Patrick Fink to introduce his team and also say a few words about the event itself, about the report that they just launched. And also after that, we will be going back to my colleague and friend, Kirsten Fontaine-Rose, to moderate the event for us. Thank you very much. And we hope that you will have a fruitful discussion with us.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for hosting this event with us. I will share my screen now, but before I get into the presentation, I want to give a couple of acknowledgements, and the first one being that in normal time, my colleague Razak would be the one doing this presentation, but he's a recent dad as of a few weeks ago, and so we decided it was worth him having some sleep and care for the baby instead of working on presenting this work. But he will be on the panel that follows this brief presentation. I've got other colleagues on the call, Kevin and Fang, who will also be on the panel, but we'll introduce them just when we get there. Just also want to acknowledge our colleagues in Iraq at the Public Policy Institute and the University of Mosul. Without them, this research would not have been possible, and it was a fairly long endeavor in the country, consultation, multiple stages, to try to make sure that we would be able to really capture the opinions and views of a wide sector of the population. And so what we've been developed in our program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative is a really locally grounded approach to try to understand people's views on peace and justice broadly, try to understand what people may have experienced during conflicts, how it's affecting them in their daily lives, things like how they relate to each other, do they trust the government, what's the even the health or mental health impact of the violence that they have experienced. But then also looking forward, what do they think needs to happen? What do people think should be done to build a lasting peace? And so, here I'll be very much focused on this kind of looking ahead. What do people want? What are some of the expectations? How do they view the process of reconstruction after the violence that they have experienced? And what we did was a fairly large consultation. As you can see, we did almost 5,000 interviews, and we looked specifically at communities that had been affected by the violence under the Islamic State, and we looked at displaced population, whether in camp or outside of camp in the Kurdistan area, but largely people coming from the Mosul area. So inside of camp and outside of camp, so we would kind of be able to compare the experience of those two groups. But we also looked at the reconstruction of Mosul itself and tried to understand the people who are now in Mosul, what was their experience, what did they expect. And so we did a fairly detailed mapping with almost 1,800 interviews in Mosul itself. And we added some surrounding communities so that we would have a bit of a comparison between the situation among communities just outside in the periphery of Mosul and communities inside of Mosul. The work was supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. The ministry played no role in the design, the analysis, the content of the research, but they generously provided funding that allowed us to do this work, and we're grateful for that. Now, part of the work and the assessment we did is based on a quantitative surveys, and that survey comes after a series of qualitative interviews to try to better understand some of the question that we should be asking, and what is relevant in the context of Kurdistan or the northern Iraq and the violence of the Islamic State. And our first general question was around trying to understand just what do people need? What are some of their current priorities? And not surprisingly, it's around security, it's around employment, basic services, and general reconstruction that we see the largest priorities. Reparation for victims was mentioned as important, but not quite as high necessarily as those very basic needs that must be met in priority. But when we ask specifically what should be done for victims, reparation was mentioned a lot more frequently. But interesting for IDPs in camp and in and out of camp, this idea of security and employment and basic services was really highlighted more frequently than among respondents in Mosul. Again, when we talked about specific measures for victims. Now, what you may see is that, those are basic needs, and it's kind of corresponds to what we've seen in many other countries where you have kind of a hierarchy or priorities. That is, at this stage, it's still about ensuring security and basic redevelopment, basic services that people need to be able to live. But this does not mean that things like justice, accountability, establishing the truth are not important. So while they may not be priorities in people's daily lives, a large majority, almost everyone, thought that it was important to understand what has happened, why it has happened, the truth, but also very important to hold accountable those who are responsible for the violence. And not just important in and of itself. It's not just for the sake of accountability, but most people told us it was important to achieve peace. So they really linked accountability, justice to peace. Now, when we ask people who should be held accountable, not surprisingly, most responses concerns the Islamic State. Whether all members, and that was the most frequent answer across the board, but it was especially among IDPs, whereas in Mosul and outside around Mosul, people may be making more distinction between IS commanders, those supporters, so different levels of involvement, if you like. But clearly, accountability of IS was critical. But what we saw was that a lot of respondents also talked about accountability of the government, of the Iraqi government, whether political officials that were responsible or involved in the violence, military commanders responsible for the violence, but also local governments. Officials who were seen as responsible for the violence. So there's really a question of the role of the Iraqi government itself, not necessarily in direct violence, but also in the role that it enabled to some extent the emergence of ISIS. Indeed, when we ask people what do they see as the perceived cause for the emergence of IS, of the Islamic State, about 50% across the board mentioned former government policy, and 25 to 40%, depending on the context, mentioned corruption. And here we talk about state corruption. I should mention that all these are open-ended questions, which means that we never suggested answers. What we did was really record what people were saying. We had pre-coded options, but only for the interviewers. But the responses were not suggested or read to anyone, so people were free to mention anything they wanted. I should also say that the interviews were done by our partner, and so done in local languages, and done in a way that was very confidential, anonymous, to make sure people were comfortable talking about those very sensitive topics. Now, I just mentioned this kind of, when we talked about accountability, people started talking to us about the government and the role of the government. And one of the finding, I would say one of the central theme of the results of the survey is around that kind of breakdown and mistrust that exists between the people and the government that's supposed to serve them. When we ask a series of general trust questions, what we found is that the trust in the Iraqi government was extremely low. In fact, it was lower than the trust in the Kurdish regional government, especially among IDP, where trust in the Kurdish regional government was actually very high. Lower than trust in the Iraqi army, lower than the trust in Peshmerga or the popular, well, not that one, depending on where you are, but certainly among the lowest levels of trust that we found. And so that really speaks to that breakdown of the relation that should exist between people and their government. And that breakdown of trust extends to the breakdown in trust in institution, in government institution, and probably the clearest is the breakdown of trust in justice and justice institution, the legal systems, where you only have less than half the people, slightly more in Mosul, but always less than half, and about 1 in 3 people among IDPs believe that justice is actually possible. 2/3 of the people believe that the legal system is corrupt. Only 15 to 25% believe it's possible to have a fair and accurate investigation of the crime committed by the Islamic State. And when we look at peace, similarly, we have fairly low percentage, especially among IDPs. Only 35% of the IDPs believe peace is possible, 70% in Mosul, so nearly twice as many. And for 40% of the IDPs, it believe that it's possible for all people to live in peace. It's higher in Mosul. I'll get back to that in a minute, but I want to highlight one kind of, tension or contradiction maybe, but it's not really a contradiction that exists in the results, is that despite this breakdown in the trust, despite this poor perception of the legal system, a large majority of the people favor having trials in Iraq. And IDPs especially favor trials in Kurdistan, which is in line with the trust in the regional government. But overall, people want to have wants to have trials in Iraq. And that's not because they don't trust international institutions. In fact, the international institutions are pretty highly trusted, but it's really about proximity. It's really around visibility, this idea that justice just not needs only to be done, but it must be seen, it must be felt in some ways. And so really an important element is having this local efforts at justice. And in fact, the majority of the people told us that they would rather forego international justice and international support if it means that it cannot have death penalty, for example. So very much a need to sense that the trials are happening in a locally acceptable manner. Now, just going back to the peace aspects, we talked about the breakdown in the relation with the government, but that's not the only breakdown, right? So when you look at IDPs and this idea that less than half the IDPs believe that it's possible for all the people to live in peace, shows that there is also a real need for reconciliation, a need for work on social cohesion, on horizontal social cohesion. So not just the government relation, the vertical relation, but this horizontal element. But yet when we ask what should be done for reconciliation, again, it went back to this idea of the relation with the government. The most frequent answer was around the need for political changes, the need for to reduce poverty, to develop the economy. And then we had a certain number of measures that did deal with accountability. establishing the truth, holding perpetrators accountable, having trials. So we see that while there is a need for horizontal element, it goes back to this idea of a vertical relation, this idea of having a government that is in some ways, in a very transactional manner, trustworthy, of a government that is providing services, a government that is caring, and a government and a justice system that are working towards establishing the truth and holding perpetrators accountable. Now, this is key because among the findings from this study, but also other studies that we have done elsewhere, I would say it's really key, not just again to achieve certain objectives, but how those objectives are achieved. And one of the key elements with justice and accountability is that, again, it's not just about having holding perpetrators accountable and rendering justice for the sake of justice, but it's also a way for government, a way for people to reestablish that relation, that vertical relation between the people and justice. In other words, if the process of accountability is seen as one that is fair, that is respecting the needs of the people, that is true justice and not impunity, then you have a chance to improve that relation. You have a chance to prove that you care for what people have experienced, and really that's what it comes down to. And so I'm not going to highlight all of the recommendation. What you see here is kind of a word cloud of what is in our recommendation, but the core of it is that the government needs to take steps to rebuild that relation and need to take steps to generally shows that it cares for the people it's supposed to serve. And that can only be achieved by developing effective, legitimate, fair, unbiased, uncorrupted, not corrupted institution and processes, including processes towards achieving truth and justice. The report has more, and I think we'll discuss the recommendation, but I'm going to stop here to give us time for discussion. But hopefully this gives a good overview of the research. The report obviously is available and hopefully will be helpful and interesting. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do this brief presentation. And now on to my colleagues. And again, one more time, thank you to the Atlantic Council for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm Kirsten Fontenrose, Director of the SCOCROSS Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And we have the benefit today of also having with us the researchers who led the field work, conducting the survey on the ground and crunching the data. We have Abdulrazak Al-Saidi, in addition to being a new father. Congratulations, Abdulrazak. He is also the research manager of this project. He is an Iraq country expert and policy advisor at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and is an expert on transitional justice and rule of law initiatives in the Middle East and North Africa. He's studied, written about, and worked on accountability measures and reconstruction of Iraq, legal and political institutions, primarily since about 2003. And between 2003 and 2016, he served as a human rights and transitional justice officer at the UN support mission in Libya. Before that, was a senior researcher focused on the Middle East with Physicians for Human Rights. Previously, Abdulrazak reported on Iraqi politics and conflict for this little publication you probably heard of called the New York Times, and he was a fellow at the Carr Center at Harvard School of Government, Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We also have joining us Dr. Phuong Pham. Phuong is the Director of Evaluation and Implementation Science at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Phuong is an assistant professor also at the Harvard Medical School and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, as well as the Director of Evaluation and Implementation Science at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, as we mentioned. She has over 15 years of experience in designing and implementing epidemiological and evaluation research in ongoing and post-conflict countries in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South America. She co-founded an organization called peacebuildingdata.org, which is a portal of peacebuilding human rights and justice indicators, as well as an organization called Kobo Toolbox, K-O-B-O Toolbox, a suite of software for digital data collection and visualization. Dr. Pham was previously Director of Research at the University of California, Berkeley's Human Rights Center, and Adjunct Associate Professor at Tulane University's Payson Center for International Development, so doing both the North and the South. Abdulrazak and Phuong will join Patrick with us in answering some questions from the audience here and from me about the research on the ground and what we can draw from the data. I will begin with 2 or 3 questions and then turn to your questions. So please feel free to submit your queries via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So let's kick it off. Patrick, Fong, and Abdurazak, among your respondents, there are clearly many differences in opinions between Mosul residents and IDPs, and Patrick touched on some of them. Which of the discrepancies are most concerning to you?
Well, thank you, Kristen, and thanks again for the Atlantic Council, and especially to Abbas and Masoud. I think there's a lot of similarity, by the way, between the perceptions of those who live in the IDP or those who live in Mosul, because all of them are an affected community by the conflict with ISIS. But what might play a role in some differences of the perceptions, it's 2 things. One, maybe it's related to the demographic breaking down. So, for example, about 60% of the IDPs in camp are Yazidis, but we don't see Yazidis within the population of the city of Mosul. And also there's Kurd population, so they are with the IDPs, but they are not in Mosul resident. Also for Shia, so only 1% for the IDPs that live in camps or not out of camps, only 1% are Shia. But we see those who live out of the city of Mosul, about 20% of them are Shia. So that might play some role, and we see some differences between the perception of the IDPs and those who live in Mosul. So three just main things with this I see. It's raised the concern. One, as Patrick mentioned, it's about peace. So in Mosul resident, both city and out of city, were more optimistic than IDPs about the potential for peace in Iraq, which is the difference is it's really significant. So among the Mosul residents, 71%, and among those who lives out of Mosul resident, it's about 73%. They believe peace is possible. Well, in the IDPs, it's only 36% who believes that the peace is possible. So that's it's a main or big difference how people think about Iraq and the peace or potential peace. The other one is the trust. Also, Patrick mentioned out. So the IDPs have less trust in the Iraqi government, army, and the PMU, the Population Mobilization Unit. So they have less trust than the resident of Mosul. However, the IDPs, they have more trust in KRG Peshmerga, which is, we think also that's due to this, which we call the social desirability bias, because the majority of the IDPs, they live or they base in Kurdistan, so they're protected by the Kurdish regional government. They're protected by the Peshmerga. So that might play a role in their perceptions when we ask them what do you think about how much you trust Peshmerga or the KRG. The last thing I would say, the last point, is about the ISIS family member integration. So the residents out of Mosul were more averse to the idea of reintegrating ISIS family member to their area of origin, which is that combined Christian, Yazidi, and Shia Muslim, which is there are about 73% of the resident outside of Mosul city. So since this group might have experienced more systematic and longer suffering, that might play or could partially explain why very high number of residents out of Mosul were strongly against the return of ISIS member families, even more strongly than, for example, the Yazidis who lives in the camp. So that's the 3 differences I would raise. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Abdurazak. And Dr. Pham, if I can turn to you with the next question, it's kind of got 2 parts. Patrick mentioned that there was a discrepancy between two things in the data. One that showed a lack of trust among respondents in Iraqi government institutions. But on the flip side, most of those who answered the survey still want those responsible for violence, whether low or high-ranking ISIS members, to be tried in Iraq. And as he pointed out, this seems a bit contradictory, and he explained a little bit. Can you dig into this? Do you believe that despite the mistrust in government institutions, people in Mosul and the surrounding areas are optimistic that justice can eventually be achieved through an Iraqi government institution? Or does this speak to a lack of trust in foreign institutions? Or is there a local justice piece to this? I want to read you something that came in this morning from the AFP. It says that Iraq executed 21 convicted of terrorism, according to medical police sources. All 21 were men from various provinces and were executed under the 2005 counterterrorism law. There were no further details on their individual crimes. They were hung Monday morning at Nasiriyah prison, the only prison that carries out executions. Do you think this is the kind of justice that respondents are talking about? Or do you think when they answered the survey and they were saying, we want ISIS members to be tried in Iraq, despite our mistrust in government institutions, that they were talking about something else?
Thank you, Kirsten, and thanks for having us here today. No, I would have to say, I think to answer directly, I think they're talking about something else. I think I'd like to bring a couple of points. It really depends on how you see this as half empty and half full, and also what is behind their response. Patrick showed a statistic that said that around 30% believe that justice is possible. So that's still a third of the population thinks that it's still possible to achieve. So it's pretty optimistic view, I would say. I had hoped that if they had zero trust at all, it would be closer to zero. But I think this is not only in Iraq, but everywhere. When we interview people after the genocide in Rwanda, with ICTR, and with regards to in northern Uganda's and DRC, with the ICC, a lot of people want the justice to be carried out locally so that they can participate, so that they can see it and hear it. As Patrick said, justice needs to be seen to be done. And so they want to be part of that process. It's less about, trust in the institutions, but it's the ability to participate, be involved, to listen, to hear, to see what's going on, because they care about the outcomes and they care about the process. And I think I think Patrick touched on this a little bit too, because it's one thing to carry out trials, but another thing to carry out effectively in a fair manner. And so I think it's not just the punishment, but it's how is done. And you can see that there's trust is very low everywhere in institutions. And so how does government do that? Patrick mentions to show them that they care, but also care about that the process is done fairly. So for example, that when they do the investigations, that is done in a fair manner. When they carry out the trials, that they carry out in a fair manner. And then also in the way which crimes are selected to be tried is also done. I think a lot of the crimes that you see is tried as terrorism, but you will see that women who were also profoundly affected by the ISIS gender-based violence, they want gender-based violence trial to be done separately, right? As a part of the charge, because they want their suffering acknowledged. So it's all of that selections is about the investigations, how the trials carried out, which crimes are acknowledged in the court, which crimes get selected. So that's really an important aspects of that. And then I think if you also look, there's a couple of things in the data that also could provide also other clues why that I think it's not insurmountable, but I think it seems if you look at in terms of people priorities, why they felt ISIS crime should be tried, and then if you look at the data on what they thought about reconciliations, there's clues to it. If you look at all of it, it says they want to improve security, that's one, but they also was worried about when they said that one of the reasons why ISIS is there was because of former government policy, and those policies has to do with jobs and employments and the implementations of basic service. So I think those are very basic livelihood aspects that the government can start working on that could also build trust. It means that those goals hasn't to be achieved, but that process of, carrying out those policy, implementing those policy is really important.
As a follow-up to that, either for you or for Patrick or Abdulrazak, when we look at the recommendations and talking about kind of the expectations of justice, how can the international community assist Iraq or support reform in the Iraqi justice process to get them to the point that they can conduct trials based on international standards or put into place the kinds of local justice that people are actually asking for? Do you have a sense of that? Any recommendations to that point?
Maybe I can start in saying first, as not a caveat, but a note that one way we approach these studies is by being fairly circumspect in our recommendation because we privilege engagement. So the idea of a research like this one is to help start dialogue and really focus more on direct discussion as opposed to very prescriptive sets of recommendations. So while we offer some recommendations, what we really privilege is this kind of discussion and the similar efforts, but directly with policymakers and decision makers. That being said,
based on that, I'm sorry to continue, but to your point, can you then talk about what recommendations from the report you think are most critical, and what you would like policymakers, for instance, to be focusing on in your recommendations?
I really think it's a strategic one. You mentioned a number of trials, a number of executions that have happened of perpetrators, but the reality is, again, if the goal of trials is just to, in the end, execute a number of people who are responsible for violence, fine. But you can do a lot more with justice. You can really work towards that building of relationship and rebuilding and recognition of what people have experienced, and making sure that the process and the strategy you're employing is actually empowering people, is actually rebuilding trust, is actually contributing to people moving on, and people realizing that actually the government is now acting in a manner that I can agree with, following a strategy of accountability that makes sense to me, following processes that I feel are fair, that are right. And it's not a new issue. The reality is that there hasn't been really a true transitional justice or even accountability strategy. There hasn't been prioritization. There hasn't been certainly no sufficient effort. The truth and reconciliation kind of approach is not something that has been really pursued strongly enough. So where the international community can help and support is both applying pressure where needed, but also offering the support, the technical, financial support to make sure that such a strategy is developed and implemented. And again, in a very participatory is not a way you like to think about justice, because justice is top down, is a judges and trial and so, but you need to think through how do we make this participatory in the sense that people feel they are involved, that they are respected. So I make this long, but I think because that's really the critical element that we touch on here when it comes to accountability and justice.
Yeah, if I may add, one thing, to the recommendation, or how can the international community help? I think two things here, the key things. One is the trust to reform. Iraqi government, Iraqi policymaker, they need make all the efforts to build the trust between them and the population. Two is the reform. Reform, it's a very critical. So, international community could provide essential and technical support to Iraqi policymaker and judiciary to reform the Iraqi legal system, and in order to build the capacity to conduct the trial based on international standards. The data shows that the majority of the affected community, they think Iraqi legal system has no capacity to address the crimes committed by ISIS. By the way, this perception, there's a lot of international experts, not just a human rights organization, but a lot of legal experts. They believe so. I'll give you an example. Iraqi law does not recognize slavery or sexual slavery, and we know this is the major crime committed by ISIS, especially against the Yazidi women and the Shia women. It's sexual slavery. So it's not just rape. Iraqi legal system recognizes rape. And also the counter-terrorist law issued in 2005, it has very broad and very definitions of all of the terrorists. Iraqi legislators, when they issued that law in 2005, in order to respond to a specific kind of terrorism, but they never thought between 2014 and 2018, there will be a woman being enslaved and sold and marketed publicly. So what kind of crime, how they address it? So that's what the Iraqi need to do, reform. They need to revise their law, and that's what the international community would contribute to provide the technical support. I know now there is some discussion in Iraq, they debate to establish a special tribunal only to prosecute the crimes committed by ISIS. Exactly what happened in 2005 during the tribunal of Saddam's, when in Iraqis, which is when I was there, we had the same debate. What kind of tribunal is the Iraqi law has the capacity to try Saddam and his regime? And the answer was no. So therefore, establish the Iraqi High Tribunal, which is now I know there's debate, and I know UN also involved at some point in this debate.
Outside of the justice systems, are there other recommendations you think that policymakers here or around the international communities should pay very close attention to?
I think the reconstruction, right? I'm sorry.
Please,
Patrick, you want to go? No, I would just say that, the reconstruction aspects of Iraq and restoring people basic livelihood, either to help them, achieve basics livelihood, get a good education, get a job, and then also for people that populations that are still living in IDP camps is to help them either relocate or help them adjust to where they're at. But I think bringing them home is an important aspects of that as well. So I would just say really basic livelihood.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start pulling in some. Oh, I'm sorry. Was there another comment to add there?
I would love to add to that because I think it's again, it's not just we saw the priorities on security, the priorities on basic services and employment. Those are key and obvious elements and part of large development efforts, and they are considered, and probably more is needed. But they are important because it's not enough, of course, to hold perpetrators accountable. You kind of have to address those basic grievances that are there and certainly fueled the rise of IS. But to me, the more critical one is that aspect of relationship and what do we do with those families of IS? What do we do with those people who were just bystanders? Maybe they did not commit crime themselves, but they knew it was happening and didn't do anything, didn't protect anyone. And those are still very strong resentments, especially among IDPs, of course, on how to deal with them. And there it was highlighted before, but it is an area where we see strong differences between Mosul and the IDPs. And so it's really key to not everyone is ever going to agree, but to at least start a dialogue so that we can come to some sort of consensus of what's the best way forward with those integration, and not just letting those things simmer, because they will fuel new conflicts in the future if they are not addressed head front. Sorry.
And that's a great point. As a follow-on to that, does the data tell us anything about whether the grievances that have been leading to protests since 2011 are being addressed or at least being effective if there are attempts at them being addressed? What are you seeing in terms of the kinds of grievances we We've watched spark protests, and then the kinds of concerns you saw respondents signal in the data.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. As Patrick mentioned and showing the data, when we ask the participants, what do you think the main reason for ISIS to murder? The answer focused on two main points. One is they said because of the former government policy and the corruption. So when they meant by the former, government, they mainly, address to al-Maliki, al-Maliki government. So here, at that time when we talk about the policy, and between after 2011 and until let us say until 2014, when ISIS occupied and controlled about third of Iraq, the corruption among the Iraqi security institution was massive, and the Iraqi security institutions is one of the most corrupt institutions. So therefore, when we saw just within a few days, tens of thousands of the troops, they just fled, and then let ISIS occupy the whole area. And the other thing is the policy. So, and the Sunni population and in the Sunnis area, and especially in Mosul, they looked at the Iraqi forces at that time as the occupied forces. That's in their perception. So they never even they said Iraqi army, they call it Maliki army. So the relationship between this, the security forces and the population was really bad, and there is, like really lack of a trust. I know that after 2014, things, or after 2017 during the liberation, things it's getting better, and the trust now between Iraqi forces, especially on the population, is it's getting much better. And at some point, the resident of Mosul, even they think even some Iraqi commanders, as they are, they are heroes. So I would say the corruption and the post-formal government was addressed, with the data, and that was maybe the main agreements of 2011 protest. And that's led us to the most demanded, one of the things when talk about the reconciliation of the future, the population said political change. So political change and political reform, again, I addressed maybe that. It's very, very critical, within so I think the Iraqi policymaker, they should really address this, which is how to reform the political system, and especially the muhassasa.
I'd like to touch on that in a moment. We're getting additional questions in, some of them not related to the survey itself, so I'm not going to go there, but we have one question. Do you see
Kristen, if I may ask a question here?
Of course, Abbas.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, because this is kind of really probably it's time to ask this question from the way I see it. When I look at this, this is extremely important, really, set of findings. When I look at the 4 top priorities on your first slide, it makes sense. There is this question about security, questions about employment or facilitating more employment, services. But when we think about IDPs, the first thing that we expect to be among the top 4 would be the return. Yet when I look at this, I find that it is in the low single digits, 7% among the Mosul residents and 10% among the non-Mosul residents. And I'm sure this is not a sign of comfort where they are. So would you like to address how you viewed this out of or counterintuitive really expectation that we will find here on this particular part?
Yeah, I think that it's really a reflection of a very realistic assessment of whether return is possible or not. And so, when the main concern is security, it shows that people just don't feel safe returning at the moment. So you cannot even start thinking of returning as a priority when the safety is not there, when the services are not there. But I would say the safety is the key one. And the safety is not one just limited to armed actors and IS, but that ties in my experience to the data we have on interpersonal relation. In other words, returning where, returning to what neighborhood, live with who. And I think there's really a fundamental question. I mean, when you see that among IDPs, very few is possible for all the people of Iraq to live together, then where do they go? And especially in Nineveh, or in Mosul, where they don't feel safe, they don't trust their neighbors, they don't see, I guess they don't see a path forward for returning. It's very concerning. It's very yeah.
There's one thing I want to add to this. So as you see in Mosul city resident, only 7%. So for a couple of reasons. Number one, they are not IDPs, they are residents. So maybe that's when we said was the priority. The other thing is there's a quite significant number of the IDPs who fled from Mosul are considered the ISIS family members, especially when they live in they base in camps, 2 camps, and Hammam al-Ali camps, and Jeddah and South Mosul. And when we have other questions, look at Dr. Abbas, look at the other data, when you see the majority of people on Mosul, they don't like the family member to return to their homes. They don't want them to return their homes. So this is big questions, what should happen to these families? The community, they don't need them to go back, and they don't also, feel safe, to be back. So this might another factors, play some role with this answer.
Thank you. These are very important nuances. I really appreciate you putting them forward.
Sure. Let's go to some additional nuance with some questions that have come in. The first is, do you see the current Iraqi government's efforts in reconciliation based mostly on dialogue, platforms, as sufficient for overcoming these gaps in what we're seeing in terms of justice and trust? And if they're not sufficient, it does sound like from what you're saying from the data that they're an understandable first step, or it would, someone could draw from that would be something that would need to happen first. Does this data or other data you've referred to point toward what might need to happen next in terms of shortening that gap in trust and the provision of justice, following on these community dialogues?
Maybe I kind of start very quick, and then maybe one of my colleagues would say. So we ask a question, and the question we ask them, what measures that would help to create unity and trust among the people of Iraq? So they responded most commonly mentioned the need for political changes and reduction of poverty. So 2 things here. Again, maybe I repeat myself every time. So the reform and political changes. So I think the current political system might not be able to promote or facilitate reconciliation and unity. I'm saying I was an Iraqi, and I've been working in Iraq, since 2003. Since 2003, I've been working in transitional justice in Iraq in many organizations, many capacity. Even I worked with Patrick and Fong in 2003 when we conduct the first kind of, survey or qualitative survey it's called the Iraqi Voices. And since that time, from 2003 till today, everyone talk about reconciliation. And when I ask many Iraqi policymakers, could you explain, we want to, reconciliation between who and who? Reconcile between who and who? I remember in 2007, one of the Iraqi officials, he had a long list and conditions for reconciliation. And he said, we would never reconcile with those who carry weapons against the government. those who attack Iraqi forces, those who promote the former regime, etc., etc. Then I told him, listen, it seems you want to reconcile with yourself or with your friends, So you have to address the other. So unfortunately, there is no vision, or there is no strategy or a clear plan for reconciliation in Iraq till now. So this is need someone to build, to build a comprehensive plan and strategies based on what the people need, what the people think, as we know, maybe this is from data could help, and also, not just that. We ask another question: is achieving justice is essential to promote reconciliations? And the answer, the majority of people say yes. So all this, I think, need to be addressed. I just want to start. Maybe my colleagues want to add.
Just maybe a very brief additional comment, because I think it ties also to the question you had earlier on the protest. And I would talk about the most recent waves of protest, which were largely around corruption, the inefficiency of services, and really that translates and undermines dialogues, because what's the prerequisite for dialogue, for moving forward? There are practical challenges to dialogue in terms of how many people can be involved and so on, but in the end, fundamentally, it's first and foremost, in my opinion, do the interlocutor come to the table with a genuine interest in moving forward? Do you feel that the government cares about you? And as long as there is widespread corruption, as long as the efforts towards services, improving services, are not seen as being genuine, as being as working, then you can really not go into a dialogue. You cannot start if you don't trust, at least to some extent, each other. Yes, of course, there's going to be always some level of mistrust, but you have to be able to believe that they are coming with your interest in mind, that it's not a predatory, not a biased or unfair process, dialogue that's going to unfold. And so dialogue is obviously important, and it's good, but are the prerequisites met for that to actually work? That would be my question.
It's a great point. We've got another question from the audience. We've got two more I'd like to hit before we finish, and I'm going to give you an advance notice, all three of you. My final question for you is going to be whether there was anything in the data that surprised you. So feel free, and if the answer is no, that's fine. Then I'll feel like we've covered everything, but I want to make sure we hit before we conclude. But this question asks, looking at the data, how much would you say the lack of effective security sector governance is the root of the problem? And I know this particular survey didn't get to opinions or feelings toward the different security services, but based on some of what we're seeing about provisions of justice and the kinds of justice people are looking for, did you get the sense, or do you have a sense from other work you've done on the ground or from your researchers on the ground in terms of context they've provided, whether or not the security sector governance is an issue or not in their feelings about justice provision?
I thought Razak was going to start, but maybe I'll jump in. It's a tough one. So there are two aspects that we wish we could have been able to do. One is that security aspect, and we've developed tools on security diagnostic and better understand relation with security actors, and just was not possible to do it here. The other aspect is more of a framework we've developed. It's called Resilience for Peace, and try to look more at what resources do people have and what assets are there, and what to move for our peace. And those are just different instruments we couldn't do here. But when it comes to the security actors, I'll hammer a little bit the same nail on the relation and the importance to engage and locally, be very much in contact, how the presence matters, how those officers behave matters. But I'll go back to the question of accountability as well. And we see that there's a demand for holding the military accountable for what they have done as well. And so a big component is is how you deal with that legacy. How do you deal with the legacy of what happened during the conflict, and acknowledge it, and frankly hold not just IS accountable for what they have done, but the military as well, and that again is a key element. And if I may, from my colleague, jump into the surprising aspect, it's a bit of a controversial one, or at least a sensitive one. But to me, it would be the importance of the death penalty. And as you know, that has been a bit of a debate and a question, because in many ways, when it comes to the international standard, but even international support for the Iraqi system, if the death penalty is on the table, it's an issue. It's just a question of international norms and standards, and intention between local demands. And in this case, there is a really strong emphasis that death penalty is needed and must be on the table. And so how do you reconcile that with this? It's kind of a dual demand, right? The norms internationally are localization and the importance to do according to what people want, but in this case what people want is something that is against the international way of thinking and norm around death penalty. So it's a very, very challenging one, and what was surprising to me, I guess, was the strength of that demand, I think.
And I just want to add, in terms of the surprise, two very quick things. One, it surprised me when I see only 22% of the Yazidi choose the international court when we ask them if people responsible for violence against civilians are taken to court, where should be tried. So I thought maybe the Yazidi community, based on, many report, and based on the lack of trust in Iraqi judicial system, they will pick international court, but only 22% of them, they pick that. So that, it surprised me. The other thing is the level of trust in Iraqi government and the legal and judicial system has not really changed, if I may say, since 2003. In 2003, I worked with Patrick and Fong, and we asked people a question: what should be done to address the legacy of the violence with the Saddam regime? And we issued the race of trust. Do you trust the Iraqi government at that time? And that was in summer 2003, just literally after the fall of Saddam regime. And they said no. I said, do you trust the Iraqi legal system? They said no. What surprised me in 2020 or about 2019, I don't see there's big difference. So still people, they don't trust the Iraqi legal system. They don't trust the Iraqi government, which is, I think that's a bit surprised me, but that's really, really important and really need to be addressed by the Iraqi policymaker. Thank you.
Fong, I'll hit your surprise in a moment, but one very last question, if we can fit it in like 30 seconds, because it's a follow-up to some of what you were saying. If we were to have trials, whether based on international norms or Iraqi norms, knowing that the level of evidence, in a local trial, certainly what we're seeing in trials for ISIS members, is difficult to reach in terms of international norms, for evidence on the ground and the exploitation of sites and the like. But one of the things that is useful in those kinds of contexts is the personal narratives and firsthand testimonies of victims themselves. Do you feel like the Yazidi women, for instance, and the people who are asking for kind of more personalized attention to the crimes against them as a community or as a subgroup, would they be willing to testify? Would they be willing to speak publicly about the horrendous things done to them? Would that be something that a risk they would be willing to take? If we could address that very quickly, and then Fong, if you could close us out with anything that surprised you in the data.
I think I can answer that one too. I would say yes, definitely. And I think maybe that's something, we always often talk about whether we should have one thing versus another, but I think having another process where you can acknowledge what happened and allow victims and survivors of these crimes to be able to speak and voice what happened to them. Like Razak said, in 2003, we had many people coming in after us, after we interviewed them, wanting to tell us more what happened to them. And still today, I was surprised to see that thirst to having the international community and everyone understand the suffering that they had suffered through, and wanting some sort of acknowledgement for that. So I think some sort of process that allow the documentations of what happened is really important. And so, I think for us, that's has been a surprise for me, to see that that thirst hasn't been met, and that actually, like Razak said, that since 2003, when we were in there in 2003, there was a lot of hope that things would change, that there would be reform, that they will get justice finally, that they will be able to rebuild Iraq, get educations, get jobs that were different. And the fact that, things hasn't dramatically changed, I think has surprised me. But that those desire is same, is still there. So I think the needs are is there, and it's been 15 years, over 15 years, and so I think changes needs to happen. Yeah, I'll leave that there and leave my colleagues to add anything they want to that.
If Patrick and Abdulrazak don't have additional thoughts to add to what Fong shared with us, is there anything else we are missing from the data? Any highlights you want to make sure that all of us, taking away from your research, walk away with, or policymakers take to heart, or the international community keeps in mind moving away from this?
I thought I saw Razak unmuting, so go ahead, Razak.
No, I don't know. I think we don't want to repeat ourselves, but I think we covered when we talk about the reform, political reform, judicial reform, when we talk about the counter the corruption. But also there is one main thing, which is the data highlighted, and I think everyone need to focus on. It's the truth. We saw there is a tremendous desire for a truth-seeking process and to find out the truth. And I think maybe now is the right time for Iraqi policymakers to establish truth commissions in order to make an historical record for what happened, why it happened, and to draw the lessons. And also, could also attribution as part of the reparation. Given maybe justice, it's a difficult to achieve for now, or maybe it's a long path, or there is a lot of difficulties. There is other approach that focus on the victim centers, which is the truth commissions, to listen to them and to get their testimony and put them on record, and that could be attributed at some point of the reparation, which is, I think that also the international community needs to help the Iraqis in order to establish this truth-seeking process.
And if I still have 1 minute, I'd like to have one more takeaway, which is going to be less on the substance or the content of the report and more on the approach or methodological in some ways. But when it comes to these post-conflict situation, you'll have tons of data on food security, on poverty, on economic development, vaccination. I mean, you've got a lot of assessments and information that exist out there. But I think it's really important to remember that this perception information is key for us to develop and think through policies that have a chance to succeed. And so it's really amazing, in having worked in the region. There are fantastic researchers, fantastic facilities, fantastic abilities to collect in a very systematic and ongoing manner these type of indicators. And there are a number of projects that try to do that, and those really should be strengthened and supported, because if you do not know how policies are perceived, if you do not know whether they are meeting the needs, expectation of people, then most likely you're not going to achieve the goals that you want to achieve when it comes to peace, reconciliation, whatever that word is. So again, really a call for this kind of data to be collected in a much more ongoing manner. And as I said at one point earlier, once you have this, then it really serves to open this dialogue, serves to open discussions on what needs to be done, not just based on assumptions, ideologies, what you think, but based on what people are telling us. And so, again, just emphasizing that maybe as a broad takeaway. But thank you so much for the opportunity to present today.
Many thanks to you. Thanks to Patrick. Thanks to Fong. Thanks to Abdelrazak. Thanks to my friend and colleague Abbas. And we really look forward to doing this again with your next body of research, with many thanks to the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative for sharing your time and sharing these takeaways with us. And please do come back and sit down with us for another discussion based on your next research project or on a consolidation of all the projects you've mentioned in this discussion today. You've made me eager to go out and read more of what you've done and combine some of these findings. So thank you again, and many thanks to our audience. We'll see you all soon.